You meet someone at 23 and they think you're brilliant. Sharp mind, interesting conversations, endless knowledge about topics that fascinate you. They're drawn to your intensity, your focus, the way you can talk for hours about subjects that light you up inside. 6 months later, they're exhausted. Not because you changed, but because they finally see what was there all along. The executive function deficit that means dishes pile up for days. The sensory issues that make you irritable in crowds or when certain textures touch your skin. The time blindness that has you showing up an hour late or forgetting plans entirely. The emotional regulation problems that swing you from calm to overwhelmed with no warning. And here's the painful truth nobody wants to say out loud. You were invisible to women for years, not because you weren't attractive or interesting, but because neurodivergent traits in men create a specific kind of social eye. Invisibility that's almost impossible to overcome until you understand what's actually happening. Let me explain what I mean by invisible, because this isn't about physical appearance or conventional attractiveness. You can be objectively good-looking and still experience this. You can be intelligent, successful in your career, funny when you're comfortable. None of that matters when your neurology creates patterns that make you functionally invisible in the social and romantic contexts where connections happen. Think about where people meet potential partners. Bars, parties, social gatherings, networking events, group activities. Every single one of these environments is specifically designed in a way that highlights neurotypical social strengths and exposes neurodivergent weaknesses. The loud music and crowded spaces that trigger sensory overload. The small talk and rapid topic switching that exhausts your processing capacity. The nonverbal social cues and unspoken rules that everyone else seems to navigate effortlessly. The expectation of spontaneous charm and easy banter. You're not invisible because you're inadequate. You're invisible because you're trying to be seen in environments where your neurology puts you at a massive disadvantage, and nobody ever explains this to you. Here's what actually happens in these social situations. You walk into a party or a bar, and immediately your brain starts working overtime just to manage the environment. The noise level makes it hard to process conversation. The lighting might be too bright or too dim. There are too many people moving in your peripheral vision. Someone's wearing cologne that makes your stomach turn. The temperature is wrong. You're already spending enormous cognitive resources just existing in the space before you've even attempted a single social interaction. Meanwhile, neurotypical people walk into the same environment, and their brains automatically filter all of that into background noise. They can focus on conversations without constantly fighting distraction. They can read the room and adjust their behavior accordingly. They can pick up on subtle interest signals and respond appropriately. They're playing a game where they know all the rules, and you're playing the same game where half the rules are invisible to you, and the other half don't make intuitive sense. So what happens? You either avoid these situations entirely, which makes you literally invisible, or you force yourself to attend and end up standing awkwardly in corners, giving off energy that reads as disinterest or social incompetence even. Though internally, you're desperately trying to figure out how to engage. And women pick up on this energy instantly. Not because they're shallow or cruel, but because humans are wired to notice social fluency as a marker of fitness. When you can't make easy eye contact because it's genuinely uncomfortable for your nervous system, it reads as lack of confidence. When you can't do small talk because your brain craves depth and substance, it reads as inability to connect. When you stand slightly too close or too far because spatial awareness doesn't come naturally, it creates subtle discomfort. When you miss timing cues in conversation and accidentally interrupt or leave long pauses, it disrupts the natural flow that creates attraction. None of these things are character flaws. They're neurological differences. But in social environments, they make you invisible or worse, visible in all the wrong ways. The cruelest part is that you often have exactly the qualities that make for excellent long-term partners. You're capable of deep loyalty and commitment. When you care about someone, you care intensely and consistently. You have rich inner worlds and fascinating knowledge bases. You're often highly principled and honest to a fault. You can hyper-focus on understanding your partner's needs once you're in a relationship. You remember details that matter. You're creative problem solvers. But none of these qualities are visible in the brief social interactions where romantic interest typically forms. Those interactions reward quick wit, smooth social calibration, effortless charm, reading and responding to subtle cues in real time. All the things your neurology makes harder, not impossible, but harder in ways that create a significant disadvantage. And here's where it gets even more painful. By the time you're in your mid to late 20s, you've internalized years of this experience. You've been overlooked, rejected, or friend-zoned so many times that it's shaped your entire self-concept. You've developed anxiety around approaching women because you've learned to expect failure. You've built protective walls because being invisible hurts less than being visible, and then rejected. You've maybe even convinced yourself you're not interested in relationships because admitting you want something you consistently fail to achieve is too painful. And all of this creates a self-reinforcing cycle where your anxiety and defensiveness make you even less approachable, which leads to more invisibility, which reinforces the anxiety. You're trapped in a pattern that nobody ever explained to you, and that you don't have the framework to understand. Let me tell you what nobody tells you about this invisibility. It's not permanent, and it's not actually about your worth. What's happening is a mismatch between your neurological operating system and the social environments where romantic connections typically form. Change the environment, and you change the outcome. This is why so many neurodivergent men finally find partners in their 30s, or through online dating, or through hobby groups, or work relationships. These contexts allow for the kinds of interactions where your actual qualities become visible. Online dating lets you communicate in writing, where you can take time to process and respond thoughtfully. Hobby groups create repeated exposure and shared interests that build connection over time, rather than requiring instant chemistry. Work relationships develop through competence and collaboration, rather than pure social performance. Suddenly you're not invisible anymore because the game has changed to one where your strengths actually matter. But here's the thing that makes this particularly hard for men. Society tells you that if you're not successful with women in your 20s, if you're not having casual relationships and dating experiences, there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Masculinity gets tied to sexual and romantic success in ways that are toxic for everyone, but especially brutal for neurodivergent men. You're supposed to be confident and assertive. You're supposed to make the first move. You're supposed to handle rejection easily and keep trying. You're supposed to read signals and escalate appropriately. You're supposed to be socially dominant or at least socially comfortable. Every single one of these expectations is harder when your brain works differently. And instead of anyone acknowledging that, you just get told to be more confident, put yourself out there more, stop overthinking, just be yourself. As if the problem is your attitude, rather than a fundamental neurological difference in how you process social information. And the women in your life often have no idea this is happening. Your female friends might genuinely like you and value you, and still never consider you romantically because they met you in contexts where you seemed awkward or anxious or socially off. They formed a first impression that's incredibly hard to change. They put you in the friend category, and that categorization is sticky. It's not that you're unattractive to them. It's that they never saw you in a context where attraction could form. Because the initial social interaction that creates romantic possibility never happened successfully. And because they're neurotypical, they don't understand that your awkwardness isn't lack of interest or confidence but sensory overload and processing differences. They interpret your behavior through a neurotypical lens where those behaviors mean something different than what they mean for you. Let's talk about what happens when you do manage to get someone interested. Maybe you meet someone online, where you can be articulate and thoughtful. Maybe you meet through friends where there's less pressure. Maybe you meet in a context where your special interests or competencies are on display. Suddenly you're not invisible anymore. Someone sees you and likes what they see. The early stage is often incredible because you can hyper-focus on this new relationship. You're attentive, thoughtful, intensely interested in learning everything about this person. You remember every detail they share. You spend hours thinking about them and planning things you can do together. You're the most engaged partner they've ever had. And this is genuine. This is you operating in your zone of strength. Deep focus on something that matters to you. Pattern recognition allowing you to understand what makes this person tick. The ability to research and learn and optimize. You're incredible at this stage. But then something shifts. The relationship becomes established and moves from the intense novelty phase into daily life integration. And this is where your neurodivergent traits start causing friction that you didn't anticipate. The executive function deficits that were easy to hide when you were only seeing each other twice a week become obvious when you're together all the time. She notices that you forget to do things you said you'd do. Not because you don't care, but because your working memory doesn't hold on to tasks the way hers does. She notices that you struggle with household tasks that seem simple to her. Not because you're lazy, but because task initiation and completion require executive function you don't always have access to. She notices that you get irritable or withdrawn in situations that don't bother her. Not because you're moody, but because your sensory processing is different and you're getting overloaded by stimuli she doesn't even register. And here's the tragedy of it. She starts interpreting these behaviors as character flaws rather than neurological differences. The forgotten tasks become evidence that you don't care enough. The household struggles become signs of immaturity or weaponized incompetence. The sensory irritability becomes moodiness or unwillingness to do things with her. Your need for alone time to recover from social situations becomes emotional distance. Your difficulty with spontaneous plan changes becomes rigidity or controlling behavior. Everything that's actually a manifestation of how your brain processes information gets reframed as a personality problem or relationship problem. And you can feel her pulling away. You can feel the disappointment and frustration building. You can see yourself becoming invisible again, but this time it's worse because you're not invisible to a stranger. You're becoming invisible to someone who once saw you clearly. This pattern repeats across relationships, and it's devastating because you're trying. You genuinely want to meet expectations. You care about your partner. You're not trying to be difficult or forgetful or rigid, but your brain doesn't work the way the relationship seems to require it to work. And nobody ever explained to you that what looks like relationship incompetence is actually your neurology, struggling with the executive function and sensory and social demands of sustained, intimate partnership. Nobody ever told you that you're not broken. You're just different. And that difference requires different strategies rather than just trying harder at the same approaches that aren't working. Nobody ever validated that what you're experiencing is real and hard, and not a moral failing. If this is hitting close to home, do me a favor and hit that like button. Because this is the conversation nobody else wants to have, honestly. The algorithm needs to know people want to hear the truth about this. Let's dig deeper into why this invisibility persists even as you get older. You'd think that with maturity and life experience, things would get easier. And in some ways, they do. You learn coping strategies. You figure out which environments you can handle and which ones drain you. You get better at masking when you need to. But here's what doesn't change: the fundamental mismatch between what women are taught to look for in partners and what you actually offer. Women are socialized to value emotional intelligence, which in practice means being able to read and respond to emotions in real time, often through nonverbal cues. They value social competence because it signals ability to navigate the world successfully. They value consistency and follow through because it signals reliability. They value spontaneity and flexibility because it signals emotional health and fun. Every single one of these values is something your neurology makes harder. And the frustrating thing is that you do have emotional depth. You feel things intensely. You care deeply about the people in your life. But emotional intelligence, as it's conventionally defined, requires skills you struggle with. Recognizing emotions in facial expressions when you're face blind or struggle with reading micro-expressions. Responding to emotional needs that are communicated indirectly. rather than stated explicitly. Regulating your own emotional responses when your nervous system has a hair trigger for overwhelm. Providing emotional support in the moment when you need time to process before you can respond thoughtfully. You have the capacity for deep emotional connection, but not necessarily the real-time social emotional skills that signal emotional intelligence to others. Same with social competence. You can be highly successful in your career and still struggle with the social aspects of networking or office politics. You can have deep friendships, but struggle with casual social situations. You can be articulate and insightful one-on-one but terrible at group conversations. And women see the struggle with casual socializing and interpret it as overall social incompetence, rather than understanding it's specific to certain contexts. They don't see how competent you are in environments suited to your neurology, because those environments aren't where romantic evaluation typically happens. They see you uncomfortable at parties or bad at small talk or awkward in groups, and they assume that's the full picture of your social capacity. The consistency and follow-through issue is particularly painful because it's one where you disappoint yourself as much as you disappoint others. You genuinely want to do the things you commit to. You have every intention of following through. But your working memory and executive function create a gap between intention and execution that feels like moral failure, even though it's neurological reality. You forget appointments or tasks, not because they don't matter, but because your brain doesn't maintain that information accessibly. You struggle to complete household projects not because you're lazy, but because task switching and sustained effort on boring tasks is genuinely harder for your brain. And when your partner sees this pattern, they can't distinguish between won't and can't. It looks the same from the outside. It looks like you don't care enough to try. And the spontaneity issue cuts deep because it's tied to how your brain handles prediction and control. Neurotypical people find spontaneous plan changes fun and exciting. For you, they're often genuinely distressing because your brain has already committed to one prediction of how the day or evening will go, and shifting that prediction requires cognitive resources you don't always have available. You need time to mentally prepare for activities, especially social ones. You need to know what to expect so you can budget your energy and attention. Surprises and last-minute changes feel threatening rather than exciting because they destabilize your ability to manage yourself. But to your partner, this looks like rigidity or unwillingness to be flexible or inability to have fun. She doesn't understand that what feels like control issues to her is actually predictability needs for you. Let's talk about the masking issue because this is where things get particularly complex. Many neurodivergent men learn to mask their traits to appear more neurotypical, especially in professional and social contexts. You learn to make appropriate eye contact, even though it's uncomfortable. You learn to do small talk, even though it feels meaningless. You learn to suppress stimming behaviors. You learn to act interested in conversations that bore you. You learn to hide your special interests because people react negatively to intense focus on niche topics. You learn to perform neurotypical social behaviors well enough to pass. And in the short term, this works. It makes you less invisible. It helps you get through social situations. It might even help you start relationships. But masking is exhausting, and it's unsustainable long-term. Every hour you spend masking is an hour you're spending enormous cognitive and emotional energy pretending to be something you're not. And the energy cost is invisible to others. They just see you successfully navigating social situations, and they assume that's easy for you. They don't see the recovery time you need afterwards. They don't see the exhaustion building. They don't see the toll it takes on your mental health. And when you're in a relationship and trying to maintain the mask, the cost becomes unbearable. You can't be your authentic self with your partner because your authentic self includes traits you've learned to hide. But you also can't maintain the mask indefinitely in an intimate relationship. Eventually the mask slips. Eventually she sees the traits you've been hiding. And then she feels deceived or confused because the person she thought she knew isn't quite who you actually are. This is why so many neurodivergent men report that their partners say things like, "I feel like I don't really know you," or you're different than I thought you were, or you've changed. You haven't changed. You've just stopped being able to maintain the performance of neurotypicality that you started the relationship with, and your partner experiences this as betrayal or disappointment rather than understanding it as you finally feeling safe enough to drop the exhausting mask. The irony is brutal. The more you try to be visible by masking, the more invisible your actual self becomes. The more you try to meet neurotypical expectations, the further you get from authentic connection. You're trapped between being invisible as your authentic neurodivergent self and being seen as a performance of neurotypicality that you can't sustain. Here's something that's going to be hard to hear, but it's important. Part of why you're invisible to women for years is because you're looking for visibility in the wrong places and in the wrong ways. You're trying to succeed at a game designed for neurotypical brains, using strategies that don't work for your neurology. It's like trying to win a swimming race by flying. You're using the wrong mode of operation for the environment you're in. And the solution isn't to get better at flying in water. The solution is to find contexts where your actual operating system is an advantage rather than a disadvantage. But nobody ever teaches you this. Instead, you get advice designed for neurotypical men that makes things worse for you. Confidence and putting yourself out there more helps neurotypical men because their barrier is often fear or lack of effort. For you, the barrier is neurological. More exposure to environments where your neurology puts you at a disadvantage just means more failure experiences. Stop overthinking helps neurotypical men who are paralyzed by anxiety. For you, thinking deeply and analyzing is often a strength, and trying to suppress it removes one of your advantages. Just be yourself helps neurotypical men who are trying too hard to impress. For you, being yourself in neurotypical social contexts means displaying traits that are interpreted negatively. The advice isn't wrong for the neurotypical men it's designed for, but it's actively harmful when applied to neurodivergent men who are facing fundamentally different challenges. What would actually help is understanding that you need different strategies. You need to identify environments and contexts where your traits are neutral or positive rather than negative. You need to find ways to connect that play to your strengths rather than your weaknesses. You need to be honest about your neurology early enough that your partner can understand what they're seeing, rather than misinterpreting it as character flaws. You need to build relationships with people who value depth over social performance, substance over smooth charm, loyalty and consistency of character over spontaneity and flexibility. These people exist, but you won't find them by trying to succeed in the environments and using the strategies that are designed for neurotypical brains. And here's the really painful realization. Some of your invisibility to women over the years was probably necessary for your own development and protection. If you had been successful in relationships before you understood your own neurology, you would have ended up in relationships where you were constantly trying to be someone you're not, constantly failing to meet expectations you couldn't meet, constantly feeling inadequate. You would have damaged your mental health trying to sustain masks and meet standards that weren't designed for your brain. The invisibility protected you from relationships that would have destroyed your self-worth. It forced you to develop your own identity and strengths rather than defining yourself entirely through romantic success. It gave you time to build competencies and resources that will serve you better than early relationship success would have. That doesn't make the years of loneliness and feeling unwanted hurt any less. It doesn't erase the damage to your self-esteem or the anxiety you developed around dating and relationships. It doesn't fix the fact that you missed out on experiences your neurotypical peers took for granted, but it does mean that your timeline isn't wrong or broken. It's just different, and when you do find relationship success, it's more likely to be with someone who actually sees and values the real you, rather than someone who's attracted to a mask you can't sustain. Let me talk about what changes this pattern, because understanding the problem isn't enough. You need actionable information about what actually helps. The first and most important thing is understanding your own neurology well enough to explain it to potential partners early in the relationship. Not as an excuse or a limitation, but as information about how you operate. This is vulnerable and scary because you're revealing things you've probably learned to hide. But it's also the only way to build authentic connection, where your partner can understand what they're seeing, rather than misinterpreting it. When you forget something, it helps if your partner knows that's a working memory issue, rather than lack of care. When you need alone time, it helps if your partner knows that's sensory and social recovery, rather than emotional distance. When you struggle with plan changes, it helps if your partner knows that's a processing issue, rather than rigidity. This requires you to understand your own patterns well enough to explain them clearly. What are your sensory triggers, and what accommodations help? What are your executive function challenges, and what support systems work? What are your social energy limits, and what does recovery look like? What are your communication needs, and how do you process information? The more clearly you understand and can articulate your own operating system, the more possible it becomes for a partner to work with your neurology rather than against it. And the right partners will be interested in understanding. They'll appreciate the honesty. They'll adjust their expectations and approaches based on information, rather than feeling constantly confused and disappointed by behaviors they don't understand. The second thing that helps is actively choosing contexts and activities for dating and relationships that play to your strengths. Stop trying to meet people in loud bars or big parties if those environments put you at a disadvantage. Instead, focus on contexts where you can actually be yourself and display your qualities. Hobby groups or interest-based communities where shared passion creates connection. Online dating where you can communicate in writing and filter for compatibility before meeting in person. Professional contexts where your competence is visible. One-on-one activities where you don't have to split attention between multiple conversations and environmental management. The right person seeing you in the right context is worth more than dozens of failed attempts in contexts where you'll never be visible. The third thing is finding partners who value what you actually offer, rather than trying to become what you think all women want. Not all women prioritize smooth social performance. Not all women value spontaneity over depth. Not all women interpret emotional intelligence as real-time social emotional responsiveness. There are women who value intellectual connection, loyalty, honesty, depth of engagement, competence, creativity, and all the other qualities neurodivergent men often have in abundance. These women exist, but they're not necessarily the women who are most visible or accessible in conventional dating contexts. They might be neurodivergent themselves. They might be introverts who value substance over style. They might be women who've been burned by smooth-talking neurotypical men and want someone genuine instead. Your job isn't to appeal to all women. Your job is to find the ones who value what you actually have to offer. Subscribe if you want more truth about neurodivergent men's experiences, because this channel is dedicated to explaining what everyone else ignores. The fourth thing is building your own life in ways that make sense for your neurology, rather than trying to fit into neurotypical life structures. Create routines and systems that work for your executive function, rather than constantly fighting against it. Design your living space to accommodate your sensory needs. Build your career around your strengths and interests. Develop your special interests without shame because they're sources of joy and competence. Cultivate friendships with people who appreciate your authentic self. The stronger your foundation is in contexts where you can be yourself, the less desperate you'll be for romantic validation, and the more you'll be able to identify partners who add to your life rather than just filling a void. And here's the thing about building that foundation. It makes you visible in the ways that matter. When you're competent and engaged in your work, you're visible as a capable person. When you're deeply knowledgeable about your interests, you're visible as someone with passion and expertise. When you have solid friendships, you're visible as someone worth knowing. When you've built systems that let you function well, you're visible as someone who has their life together. All of this creates a context where romantic connection becomes possible because you're being seen for who you actually are rather than how well you perform neurotypicality in social situations. The invisibility to women for years wasn't about your worth or your potential as a partner. It was about a fundamental mismatch between your neurology and the contexts where romantic connections typically form, combined with misunderstanding of your traits as character flaws rather than neurological differences. Once you understand this, you can stop trying to fix yourself and start building a life and pursuing connections in ways that actually work for how your brain operates. You can stop internalizing failure as evidence of inadequacy and start seeing it as information about what contexts and approaches don't work for you. You can stop chasing visibility in spaces where you'll never be seen clearly and start showing up in spaces where your actual qualities become apparent. Let me be really direct about something. If you're neurodivergent and male, and you've spent years feeling invisible to women, you've probably developed a lot of pain around this. You've probably internalized messages about your inadequacy. You've probably built defensive walls or given up on relationship possibilities. You've probably compared yourself to neurotypical men and found yourself lacking. You've probably wondered what's wrong with you that you can't seem to succeed at something that seems easy for others. And all of that pain is valid. The years of loneliness and rejection and feeling fundamentally unlovable leave scars. But here's what I need you to understand. The invisibility wasn't about you being inadequate. It was about you being evaluated in contexts and by standards that were never designed for your neurology. Think about what happens when you put a fish out of water. The fish isn't broken or inadequate. It's just in the wrong environment for its biology. Put it back in water, and suddenly all its adaptations make sense. Its streamlined body that looked awkward on land moves gracefully through water. Its gills that couldn't extract oxygen from air work perfectly in their intended medium. Its fins that were useless for walking propel it efficiently. Nothing about the fish changed. Only the environment changed. And in the right environment, the fish isn't just adequate, it's beautifully adapted. You're not broken. You're not inadequate. You've been trying to succeed in environments and by standards that don't match your neurology. And the solution isn't to become a different kind of person. The solution is to find your water. That might mean finding partners through different channels than conventional dating. It might mean being honest about your neurology earlier than feels comfortable. It might mean prioritizing compatibility over chemistry, because long-term compatibility matters more than initial spark. It might mean choosing partners who are neurodivergent themselves, or who have experience with and appreciation for neurodivergent people. It might mean building relationships slowly through friendship first, rather than trying to generate romantic intensity quickly. It might mean all of these things, but whatever your path is, it starts with understanding that you're not the problem. The mismatch is the problem, and you can address mismatch in ways you can't address inadequacy. Here's the final piece of this that I need you to really hear. The invisibility you experienced for years serves a purpose once you get to the other side of it. It forces you to develop yourself in ways you wouldn't have if relationship success came easily. It forces you to build identity and self-worth that isn't dependent on romantic validation. It forces you to develop interests and competencies and internal resources. It forces you to get honest about who you are, rather than who you think you should be. All of that makes you a better partner when you do find someone who sees you, not because you needed to earn the right to relationship through suffering, but because the person you become through navigating that invisibility is someone with depth and self-knowledge and authenticity that shallow relationship success would never have required you to develop. And when you do find someone who sees you clearly and values what they see, the relationship has a foundation that relationships built on masks and misunderstanding never have. Your partner knows who you actually are from the beginning. They chose you with full information rather than discovering deal breakers later. They value your actual traits rather than tolerating them. They work with your neurology rather than expecting you to overcome it. The relationship can be built on authenticity rather than performance. And that kind of relationship, when you find it, is worth every year you spent feeling invisible, because it's the kind of relationship where you can finally stop hiding. The painful truth nobody admits is that being neurodivergent and male creates specific challenges in romantic contexts that are rarely acknowledged or addressed. The invisibility you experienced wasn't your imagination or your fault. It was the predictable result of trying to be seen in contexts where your neurology puts you at a systematic disadvantage. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain of those years, but it does give you a framework for moving forward that's based on reality rather than self-blame. You can stop trying to fix yourself and start building a life that works for your neurology. You can stop chasing visibility in spaces where you'll never be seen, and start showing up where your qualities actually matter. You can stop internalizing failure and start collecting information about what works for you. The invisibility wasn't permanent and it wasn't deserved. It was circumstantial. And circumstances can change when you understand what you're actually dealing with and make choices based on that understanding rather than on standards that were never designed for your brain. Drop a comment if this resonates with your experience, because I want to know if this is hitting the truth that you've lived through. The invisibility was real, the pain was valid, but it wasn't the end of your story. It was just the beginning of understanding who you actually are and what you actually need. And that understanding changes everything.